She was turned away from every house on Christmas until the Lakota brave opened his door. The first door closed before she could finish saying, "Merry Christmas," the wood thudding shut with a finality that stole the warmth from her breath as surely as the cold had numbed her fingers. And she stood there for a moment on the porch, hands clasped tight against her thin coat, listening to muffled laughter and the scrape of chairs being pulled closer to a fire that wasn't meant for her. Snow pressed softly into the hems of her boots as she stepped back down, the night air sharp enough to sting her lungs. And she told herself the next house would be different because Christmas was supposed to mean something even in a town like this. But the second door didn't even open all the way. Just a crack, a wary eye, and a quick shake of the head before it shut again, followed by the sound of a bolt sliding into place. She moved on, shoulders hunched, breath fogging in uneven bursts, knocking at a third house where a candle glowed warmly in the window. And when a woman answered, she barely looked at her before saying, "We've already got company," as if kindness had a limit, and she'd exceeded it simply by existing. The street felt longer with every step, the snow crunching louder in the silence, and she passed the church with its doors closed tight, hymns leaking faintly through the walls, the irony burning sharper than the cold as she pressed her palm to the wood and felt no movement from inside. At the inn, a man peered out, took in her worn coat and trembling hands, and told her there were no rooms without even checking, his gaze sliding away as though shame were contagious. And she nodded because arguing took energy she no longer had. By the time she reached the edge of town, her feet ached and her fingers had gone frighteningly numb, and she leaned against a fence post to steady herself, wondering how many doors a person could knock on before it became clear they were not meant to be answered. That was when she noticed the small cabin set back from the road, a thin line of firelight spilling through the seams, and she hesitated. Not hopeful now, just desperate enough to try once more, raising her hand to knock with knuckles that barely felt the wood. For a heartbeat there was nothing, and she braced herself for another refusal. But then the door opened fully, and a Lakota brave stood there, tall and still, the warm glow of the fire at his back, his eyes taking her in without judgment as the cold wind pushed against her spine. And he said nothing at first. He simply stepped aside, opening the door wider, as if the answer had been decided long before she asked. She hesitated on the threshold, the heat from the cabin brushing her face like something she didn't deserve, and the Lakota brave noticed immediately, not with impatience, but with a quiet awareness that made her pause feel seen rather than awkward. Behind him the fire crackled low, filling the small room with a steady warmth that contrasted painfully with the cold still clinging to her coat. And when she didn't step forward right away, he nodded once, as if acknowledging the weight of all the doors that had closed before this one. "Come in," he said gently, not raising his voice, not rushing her, and she crossed the threshold on unsteady legs, the snow melting from her boots into small, dark pools on the packed floor. He closed the door against the wind without locking it, an intentional choice she felt more than understood, and motioned her toward the fire, keeping a respectful distance as she lowered herself onto a bench, her hands shaking now that the danger of the cold had eased enough to let exhaustion surface. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was careful, giving her space to breathe without being questioned, and she stared at the flames as feeling crept painfully back into her fingers, each pulse a reminder of how close she'd come to losing more than warmth. Outside, the sound of laughter drifted faintly from the center of town, bells chiming somewhere down the street, and she flinched at the reminder of how easily she'd been turned away. But the Lakota brave shifted a kettle closer to the fire and poured warm water into a cup, setting it within her reach without comment. She accepted it with both hands, the steam fogging her eyes as she whispered, "Thank you," a reflex more than a statement, and he inclined his head as though gratitude were unnecessary. After a moment he spoke again, not asking her story, only stating, "You can rest here tonight," and the certainty in his tone settled something tight in her chest. It wasn't an offer that could be withdrawn or weighed against conditions, just a fact. She nodded, swallowing against the lump in her throat, and for the first time since nightfall allowed herself to lean back, the firelight warming her face as her shoulders sagged. Outside, another door slammed somewhere in town, sharp and final. But inside the cabin the sound barely reached her, softened by wood and warmth, and the presence of someone who had chosen to open his door when the world decided not to. The Lakota brave settled on a low stool across from her, far enough to leave the space between them untouched, close enough that the fire's glow held them both in the same circle of warmth. And for a long moment neither of them spoke. The silence shaped not by discomfort, but by the careful understanding that some stories arrive only after the body feels safe enough to remember. She cradled the cup in her hands, letting the heat soak into her palms, and stared at the flames as if they were the only steady thing left in the night, her breathing gradually slowing while the ache in her chest loosened its grip. He watched her without staring, his gaze shifting occasionally to the door as though measuring the cold she'd come from and the town she'd walked through. And when she finally lifted her eyes, their brief meeting held no curiosity sharpened by judgment, only recognition, as if he understood what it meant to stand outside warmth and be told you did not belong there. She cleared her throat, intending to speak, but the words tangled and fell apart, and she shook her head, embarrassed by the failure. Yet he didn't press, didn't lean forward or ask questions. Instead, he reached for a folded blanket resting beside the hearth and placed it on the bench near her, not touching her, not instructing her, simply making the option visible. She wrapped it around her shoulders slowly, the weight of it grounding her, and as the warmth settled she realized how badly she'd been bracing herself for the next refusal, the next demand, the next reason she should leave. Outside, a gust rattled the cabin walls, and instinctively she flinched, memories of closing doors and turning backs flashing sharp and fast. But the Lakota brave rose and adjusted the latch with calm efficiency, ensuring the door was secure without sealing her in, and returned to his seat as if the act were nothing more than tending a fire. After a while, he spoke again, his voice low and even. "The night is hard," he said simply, not accusing the town, not praising himself, only naming what was true. She nodded, the understatement striking deeper than any sermon could have, and the quiet acceptance of her nod felt like permission to exist without explanation. When she finally whispered, "I knocked on every house. It wasn't a plea or a complaint, just a statement of fact," and he acknowledged it with a single, solemn nod, his eyes steady, as though her endurance mattered even if the town had chosen not to see it. The fire popped softly, sending a brief shower of sparks upward, and in that small, ordinary sound, she felt something shift, subtle but real. The sense that being welcomed did not have to come with questions, and that sometimes the bravest mercy was simply making room for someone to sit, warm, and breathe through the night. The fire settled into a steady burn, and with it the night seemed to slow, the sharp edges of the cold easing just enough for her to notice how heavy her legs felt and how deeply the quiet pressed against her ears after hours of rejection. She shifted on the bench, adjusting the blanket, and the Lakota brave noticed without comment, rising to place another small log onto the coals so the warmth wouldn't fade while she rested. From the cabin's single window she could see the town's main street, lanterns glowing behind drawn curtains, shadows moving where families gathered close, and the sight tightened her chest. Not with envy, but with the dull ache of being reminded how easily she had been refused, again and again, as though her need were an inconvenience Christmas itself did not want to acknowledge. He followed her gaze and said only, "Many doors close tonight, not as condemnation, but as a truth spoken plainly," and the simplicity of it loosened something inside her that had been clenched since dusk. She swallowed and found the courage to speak a little more, her voice low so it wouldn't disturb the fragile peace she felt settling in. "I wasn't asking for much," she said. "Just a corner to sit until morning." He inclined his head, listening fully, not interrupting, not correcting, and when she finished he answered with the same steadiness he had shown since opening the door. "You were asking for warmth," he said. "That is not much." The words landed gently but firmly, and she felt a sting behind her eyes that had nothing to do with smoke. Outside, footsteps passed, then slowed, then moved on, and she realized with a faint shiver that had she still been out there, someone might have turned her away yet again without ever seeing her face. The Lakota brave stood and set a small plate of food on the bench beside her. Simple, modest, clearly meant to be shared, and stepped back to give her space, the gesture saying more than any reassurance could. She ate slowly, savoring not just the warmth, but the dignity of being offered something without having to beg or explain, and when she finished, she set the plate aside, her hands steadier now. The firelight flickered across the walls, casting calm shadows instead of judgment, and for the first time that night, she allowed herself to lean back, listening to the quiet sounds of the cabin, the crackle of wood, the wind softened by walls, the presence of someone who had chosen mercy without ceremony. Christmas bells rang faintly in the distance, and though the town had closed its doors, she understood now that one open door, offered without condition, was enough to carry her through the night. The warmth began to work its way deeper, no longer just thawing her fingers but loosening the tight, careful posture she'd carried all evening, and as sensation returned, she winced, a sharp hiss escaping before she could stop it when she shifted her feet beneath the bench. The Lakota brave noticed instantly, not with alarm, but with attentiveness, and he crossed the room to kneel a short distance away, keeping his hands visible and still as he asked quietly, "Your feet?" She nodded, embarrassed by the sudden vulnerability, and he fetched a basin of warm water, setting it near her boots without touching her, waiting until she loosened the laces herself. The simple courtesy of patience easing the sting of pride she'd swallowed all night. When she finally slipped her boots off, the redness and swelling were impossible to miss, and she bit down on her lip as the heat of the water met skin gone numb and sore from hours in the cold, her breath stuttering until it found a rhythm again. He placed a folded cloth beside her and stepped back, allowing her to tend to herself, and only when she faltered did he ask, "May I?" 2 words that carried more respect than any door she'd knocked on that evening. She nodded, and he moved carefully, wringing the cloth and pressing it gently where the pain was worst, his touch sure but restrained, never lingering longer than needed, and the relief that followed was so sudden it made her eyes burn. Outside, the wind howled briefly, rattling the walls, and instinctively she tensed, but he didn't hurry or change his pace, grounding the moment in calm until the noise passed. "You walked far," he said, not as a question, and she managed a small nod, her voice thin when she replied, "Every street," and he acknowledged it with a quiet hum, as if the distance mattered, as if endurance counted. When he finished, he set the cloth aside and stood, offering her the space to collect herself, and she realized she was breathing easier now, not because the pain was gone, but because she was no longer bracing for the next refusal. The fire popped softly, the room steady and warm, and as she pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, she understood that care, when offered without demand, could be as powerful as shelter itself, and that tonight In this small cabin, someone had chosen to see her need and answer it without asking her to justify why she deserved warmth on Christmas. When he finished tending to her feet, the Lakota brave stepped back to his stool and settled there again, leaving the space between them open and unclaimed, and the quiet that followed felt different now. Not fragile, not tentative, but grounded, as if the cabin itself had accepted her presence and would hold it through the night. She flexed her toes slowly, testing the relief, and a soft breath escaped her that surprised them both, carrying with it the tension she'd been gripping since the first door shut in her face. Outside, the wind softened, snow whispering against the walls instead of biting, and the fire's steady glow painted the room in warm amber that chased the cold from the corners. He watched the flames for a moment, then spoke without turning. "This town forgets," he said, not accusing, not bitter, simply stating a truth shaped by long observation. "It forgets who stands in the cold when the lights are bright elsewhere." She nodded, understanding settling in her chest as something shared rather than explained, and the silence that followed felt companionable, like two people acknowledging the same truth from different paths. A knock sounded faintly somewhere outside. Another house, another refusal, and she flinched despite herself, the memory of raised hands and closed doors flashing sharp and unwelcome. But the Lakota brave rose calmly and checked the latch again, the simple act anchoring her back to the present. "You are safe here," he said, not as a promise meant to impress, but as a statement meant to steady, and she believed him because nothing about his manner asked her to trust beyond what he'd already shown. She found her voice again, quieter now, stronger for having rested. "I didn't want to trouble anyone," she said. "It's Christmas." He turned then, meeting her eyes with a steady compassion that didn't soften into pity. "Kindness is not trouble," he replied. "It is a choice." The words settled gently, rearranging something inside her that had been bent by too many rejections, and she felt her shoulders drop as if she'd been carrying an invisible weight all evening. He returned to his seat, and they sat together listening to the fire and the wind and the distant bells, each sound placed back where it belonged. She realized then that the town's closed doors no longer defined the night. This open one did. And in the shared quiet, without ceremony or claim, she understood that dignity could be restored not by crowds or declarations, but by one person choosing to open a door and keep it open long enough for the cold to lose its hold. By morning, the town had begun to notice the absence it had created the night before, and word moved in low currents along the street as shutters opened and people stepped out into the pale Christmas light, their conversations drifting toward the single question no one wanted to ask aloud. Where had the woman gone? She watched from the cabin window as neighbors passed by in small groups, their laughter thinner than it had been the night before, their eyes lingering on the empty stretch of road where she had stood, knocking until her hands shook, and the sight stirred a complicated ache in her chest. Not anger, exactly, but the quiet reckoning that comes when harm has already been done. The Lakota brave brewed tea and set a cup near her without comment, and together they listened as the town's unease took shape outside. A man muttering about turning someone away on Christmas, a woman insisting she hadn't known it was so cold, another voice saying the church doors should never have been shut. No one came to the cabin at first, but the guilt traveled faster than footsteps, and she felt it in the way the morning carried less certainty than the night before. Later, the sheriff's boots crunched past the window, slowing as he noticed the cabin's door closed against the wind, and though he didn't knock, his pause was long enough to tell her that the town was beginning to understand where it had failed. She turned back to the fire, the warmth steady now, and realized that being sheltered did not erase the memory of rejection, but it did give her the strength to hold it without being crushed. The Lakota brave spoke quietly, as if answering the movement beyond the walls. "They will speak of it today," he said. "Some will be ashamed, some will excuse themselves." She nodded, knowing both were true, and the clarity of his words steadied her more than reassurance ever could. Outside, a group gathered near the church steps, heads close, voices subdued, and she recognized a woman who had shut her door early in the night, her posture now tense, hands clasped tight, as if prayer could undo what had already passed. The Lakota brave didn't tell her to face them or hide from them. He let the choice remain hers, and that freedom felt like another kind of shelter. She wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders, drew a slow breath, and understood that the town's reaction, whatever shape it took, could not rewrite the simple truth of the night before. When every door had closed, one had opened, and that choice had changed the story Christmas would tell this year, whether the town was ready to admit it or not. The sound of voices rose by mid-morning, no longer scattered and uncertain but gathered with purpose, and when she stepped back to the window, she saw the town forming itself into something unmistakable. A crowd near the church steps, coats pulled tight, faces turned toward one another with the restless energy of people who knew they had been seen at their worst and did not yet know how to respond. The sheriff stood at the center, his hat held stiffly in both hands, speaking in low tones to a few men who nodded without conviction, and though she could not hear the words, the posture told its own story. Authority searching for a way to contain a shame that had spread too far to ignore. A woman pushed forward, the same one who had closed her door early the night before, her cheeks flushed, her hands trembling as she spoke too quickly, gesturing toward the road as if pointing away from her own choice might lessen its weight. Others joined in, excuses layered over regret, explanations offered like offerings too late to matter, and the crowd shifted, restless, uncomfortable, aware now that Christmas had not passed them by quietly, but had left a mark they could not smooth over. The Lakota brave watched from the doorway, his presence calm and unmistakable, not hidden, not confrontational. Simply there. And when the sheriff finally noticed him, the pause that followed rippled through the group like a held breath. A few men looked away, others stared openly, and she felt the familiar instinct to retreat, to make herself smaller before judgment could form. But the Lakota brave did not move aside or step forward. He remained exactly where he was, a steady line between the warmth behind him and the reckoning outside. The sheriff spoke again, louder now, his words carried by the cold air, and though she could not catch every sentence, the meaning was clear enough. The town had turned someone away on Christmas, and it would not be ignored. A murmur moved through the crowd, uneasy, defensive, then faltering, and one by one, people began to realize that no explanation could erase the image of a woman walking the streets alone in the snow while their fires burned bright. She stood just inside the cabin, heart pounding, the blanket heavy around her shoulders. And for the first time she understood that this moment was not about punishment or forgiveness. It was about witness. The Lakota brave glanced back at her once, a silent question in his eyes, and when she met his gaze, she didn't nod or shake her head. She simply stayed where she was, allowing the truth of the night to stand in the open, finally seen by the very people who had refused to see her at all. By the time the crowd dispersed, the morning had softened into a pale winter calm, the sharp edges of accusation giving way to a quieter understanding that could not be undone by a single apology or promise. And she stood just outside the cabin now, the snow beneath her boots no longer biting but firm and steady, as if the ground itself had decided to hold her weight at last. The sheriff lingered a moment longer, offering no speech meant for praise or closure, only a nod that carried responsibility rather than authority. And when he turned away, the town followed him back toward its routines, changed not by spectacle, but by the memory they would have to live with. The Lakota brave remained beside her, silent as ever, his presence unclaimed and unassuming, and she realized that he had never positioned himself as her savior or her answer, only as the one who had opened a door when it mattered most. She adjusted the blanket on her shoulders and looked once more toward the row of houses that had refused her the night before, and though a few doors cracked open now, tentative and uncertain, she did not move toward them, understanding that dignity restored did not require her to test those thresholds again. Instead, she turned back to the cabin, to the fire that had burned through the longest night she could remember, and felt something settle into place inside her, something steadier than hope and quieter than gratitude. "I will remember this," she said softly, not as a vow or a farewell, but as a truth, and the Lakota brave inclined his head in acknowledgement, as though remembering were enough. As she stepped back inside, the door closing gently behind her, she knew that Christmas would always carry the weight of that night, the cold, the silence, the doors that shut. But it would also carry the warmth of one that opened without hesitation. Outside, the town resumed its life, altered in ways it would not immediately see, while inside the cabin the fire continued to burn, indifferent to judgment, and unchanged by crowds. And in that quiet space, she understood that mercy did not need witnesses to be real, but when witnessed, it had the power to reshape a place, leaving behind not a miracle, but something rarer and more enduring. The memory of a single choice that refused to let the cold have the final word. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had seen her knocking on doors in the snow, would you have opened yours or hoped someone else would? Tell us in the comments. The crowd shifted again, but this time the movement was slower, heavier, as if the weight of what had been done had finally settled into bones and breath, and the sheriff cleared his throat before speaking with a firmness that cut through the murmurs, naming plainly what the town had tried to soften with excuses, that a woman had been turned away in the cold on Christmas night, and that no tradition, no full house, no fear could justify it. Heads bowed, some in shame, some in stubborn defiance. But when the Lakota brave stepped forward just enough to be seen clearly, the air changed. Not with threat, but with gravity, and the sheriff's voice faltered for a fraction of a second before continuing, acknowledging the door that had opened when all others closed. A few townsfolk looked toward the cabin then, really looked, and she felt their attention like a tide pulling at her chest. But she did not retreat. She stood where she was, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders like armor that did not harden her heart. A woman broke from the crowd, hands clasped tight, her voice shaking as she said she hadn't known how bad it was, that she thought someone else would help. And though the words were familiar, the difference now was that they were spoken aloud, in front of witnesses, unable to hide behind locked doors. The sheriff nodded once, not absolving, not condemning, only marking the truth, and he turned to the Lakota brave with a quiet respect that had not been there before, stating plainly that the town would make amends, not through charity offered in secret, but through acknowledgement in daylight. The Lakota brave listened without interruption, his posture unchanged, and when he finally spoke, it was not to demand anything for himself, but to say, she needed warmth, she was given it, and the simplicity of the statement silenced the last defenses the crowd had tried to raise. A hush followed, deep and uncomfortable, and in that space the town saw itself clearly, not as it wished to be remembered, but as it had been. She felt a tremor pass through her, not fear, but release. the kind that comes when harm is finally named without being softened or denied. The sheriff removed his hat fully now, holding it against his chest, and declared that no one in this town would be turned away again without the weight of this night following them. And the murmured agreement that followed was not triumphant, but subdued. The sound of people accepting responsibility rather than seeking praise. She drew a steady breath, the cold morning air filling her lungs, and for the first time since the doors had closed, she felt the ground beneath her feet hold firm, as if the town itself had finally stopped pushing her away.